keep? You guys want to keep talking about your pain, and then I'll lead us in eventually.
I have to just kind of like preface this with I was very very excited when Rob mentioned that we were doing a episode about Catholicism because your boy grew up Catholic. Did not realize when I was like trying to just like not even really do research, just trying to get myself like more familiar with the what we were talking about and whatnot. How much of this bullshit I've just internalized is just normal, and none of this stuff is normal. Absolutely none of it. And I just have to like finally, kind of, for the first time in my life, taking that step back and realizing, like, damn, like Catholics are fucking wacky.
It's really funny how that happens because it's true. It's like you go to mass a certain number of times when you're a kid, or you go with your family, or you go for the holidays or whatever. And before you know it, it's like you're this little sponge and you've absorbed so much of this, right? So it was funny because I didn't realize how much I remembered about the Bible until I went to college and I started talking to friends. And I was like, oh shit, I remember that. Like, I remember that story and I remember that fable. And it's crazy. Like, I when we were doing CCD, I don't know what you guys call it over. Do you guys call it CCD when you prepare for your first communion? We had
Do you call it CCD? That's huge in Boston. Everyone's like, I think I've told this story before, but like as a kid, people would ask me like, why don't you have to go to CCD? And I'm like, I don't know.
What does CCD stand
it's just
for?
like Catholic.
I actually don't remember what it stands for, but it's like you go to school. You go to like once a
Catholic
week.
School.
It's Catholic school, and you prepare for
Sunday
your first
school.
communion and your confirmation, and they teach you
Did
about
you have yours at the same? Did you have yours at the same time, or did you have yours at different times?
different times. And so I had my first communion when I was like 9 or 10, and then I had my confirmation when I was like 12. With Dan Marino's son, so yeah, with the Dolphins. You're just chilling in the back of the church,
Dan Marino,
probably drinking
good
wine.
Catholic.
Yeah, good drunk Italian Catholic over there. Yeah, but no. What I was gonna say is I remember watching these crazy videos of like being a virgin and not forget about having sex, about like not kissing anybody, before you get married. And I'm like, what the hell is this? Like, it was just really crazy because for me, it was always those really interesting messages of, when you're in these formal settings, whether it's CCD or church, you get these messages that are very strict, right? I remember our priest once was like making a public message in front of everybody saying like, please remember to like dress respectfully when you come to church. And I was like, whoa, like what the hell? Like he was talking about, people wearing like, and then you hear that message and then you'd see everybody at like the Thanksgiving fair, just like drunk off their ass, like just like throwing up behind the roller coasters, and just like you see all the repression coming out when you add like a little bit of that alcohol into it. So yeah, I don't know. I had some interesting times. I mean, I haven't been to church in a long time, but when I went to college, you were saying, yeah.
Oh no, I'm just saying kind of like in one, because I don't think I had that now that I think about it, because I went to Catholic school. So you would do your preparation as like a class during like the week or whatever. So you would have, what's it called? Yeah, like you'd have like your like religion class would be then like when communion was coming up, you would then like take the hour of religion class, and then you would then go to do the like activities to then prepare for that. So that's why I think I don't know what CCD is.
Oh, that's interesting. School. Yeah. So for us, it was like Monday night or Wednesday night. You'd go after school. It was like
Monday
an hour.
night Catholicism.
Yeah, it was like that. It was like Monday Night Football. Yeah. And it was crazy because, I mean, that was when I was a teenager. And actually around the same time as when I began to have like Jewish friends and Baptist friends and all sorts of Protestant American friends. And, I was getting invited to like bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs at school. And I remember... one of my friends invited me to their church, but they weren't Catholic. They were just Protestant, I guess. And my mom was like, wait, so where are you going? And I said, I'm going to go to this thing that they have a pizza night and you get to watch football and they have a band and whatever. And my mom's like, what the fuck is that? She's like, what does that have to do with being religious? And I'm like, I don't know, but they're inviting me.
Where's the suffering?
Yeah, exactly. And she's like, wait, who's leading this? And I'm like, this guy's name is Pastor Matt. And it was like, pastor? Like, what the fuck is a pastor? And then, so then
why does he sit backwards in his chair? They're supposed to sit frontwards.
Yeah.
The chair is
and and then they drove me over, and we're pulling up, and she's dropping me off at this church that's like right close to my house, and she says, "Well, if they start talking to you about God and Jesus, just run away. Just call me. Just like leave. If they try to like convert you to their weird cults, just like leave." And I'm like, "Okay, Mom, don't worry." And I just show up, and it's a bunch of my friends eating pizza and playing video games. And like Pastor Matt is just kind of like just somewhere doing something.
Press like BBA. On Super Smash Bros. You were converted to Protestantism. It's irreversible.
Oh yeah, you bet. Yeah. Yeah. Oh my God. But
I think we can. I
think you guys have proven your credentials here on this. For this
I just wanted to say one last thing because I was looking up because there is something really specific about this with euthanasia that comes up with the Catholic Church taking very strong stand later on in the episode. Maybe we cover it. I don't know, but this just shows that how how my brain was just molded into all this bullshit is that then I did not know what euthanasia was, but yet you continuously pray for it every single week that pray for against euthanasia. I thought they literally meant like children in Asia, like youth in Asia. So I remember just like one day after Mass, I would ask my mom, like, I'm like 9 years old. I'm like, "Mom, why do we keep praying for all the kids in Asia?" She's like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" I'm like, "Euthanasia." She's like, "No, that's when you put someone under and you kill them." I'm like, "Oh,
that's
okay."
hilarious.
That didn't seem to like ring in my head that worth needed to be prayed for.
Oh my God.
In Asia.
And this, I know almost nothing about Catholicism, so not in any sense that I'm leading you at all, but like. You guys are Dante and I'm Virgil in the sense that I'm just some old pagan guy who's here along for the ride. Like everything you guys say, I'm just gonna be like, yeah, damn, that's crazy.
It is. It's gonna get wild.
Welcome everyone to a very special edition of Corner Späti. That's right. It's the Big Dog Hour. No, we have a. I'm very excited for the episode today. We have a lot planned for you, and that's because we have a very special guest. You may know him already if you're familiar with the Rob Extended Universe. That is one of my best friends and colleagues, Ricardo Alvarez-Pimentel, PhD candidate at Yale University, historian of Mexico, the right, the Catholic right. The international networks of religion and politics, and much more. Co-host of The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. Ricky, what's up?
Hi, Rob. Hi, everybody.
Yeah, sorry. Nick's here too. You already did the woof woof.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
So I want to say hi to Rob and
Nick. Rob,
yeah.
I know it's your first time introducing the show because I let you. So next time, just so you know, you introduce us and then the guest. God, common etiquette.
Ricky's basically a co-host. He's one of us.
Wrong show. I'm the co-host. He's the guest. Unless this is an episode for your other show.
We'll see about that.
If so, then you have to edit. I'm not editing it.
So yeah, today we're going to maybe Ricky can give like his academic expertise and how this episode is going to go. But basically what we've cooked up is like a review of like 20th century Catholicism and politics, especially right-wing politics. And what are the connections between basically what forms do right-wing politics take? How is that expressed through religion? How is that done or organized by the Catholic Church or right-wing Catholic networks? And then a more like theoretical or broader level, like what does it mean to think about ideas of change, of political revolution, and how does Catholicism and how does religion fit into that? I don't know. Is there anything you want to add to that, Ricky?
So let me start just by formally saying thank you to both of you for having me here as the guest on the show. So thanks to Nick and Rob, and also saying hi to all the listeners that are out there. Some of you might know me from, as Rob mentioned, our other podcast, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. But this is my first time here, hopefully not my last, and it's exciting to just speak to a new audience about these issues. I know that Rob and I just formally did an episode on fascism that was published about maybe 2 weeks ago now. So it'll be interesting if you are hearing this episode and you want to check out our podcast to just click on there. And it's the latest episode that should be up there to see how these issues of Catholicism that we're going to be talking about connect to broader conversations about fascism and, as Rob mentioned, right-wing politics in the 20th century. So I'm excited to be here. Thank you both for having me. So I think there's a lot for us to talk about in this discussion about Catholicism in the 20th century and how it intersects with politics. So I think I'll just begin by talking a little bit about my own work and what I am studying and basically writing my dissertation about right now. And then we'll just
I'll
see
do a
what
little preface, actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because,
go ahead.
we're supposed to be European politics and European history, and I promise we got the heavy hitters of 20th century post-war Catholicism coming up, including one man I like to call Polish Obama. But I think that
even if it is so that like Latin America or whatever, like the Catholic Church is one of like the biggest arbiters of imperialism.
Yeah,
it's fine. It's European. It's all what.
It's all connected.
Yeah,
it's entanglement.
Yeah,
Bob.
exactly. We
all
don't need to
entanglement.
apologize because we're reaching over into other countries to discuss something that then like Europe is still at the helm of.
Yeah.
So,
but I just wanted to introduce what Ricky's going to talk about because I think he's going to go into the Mexican Revolution, the Cristero War, and it might sound kind of very like locally specific or regionally specific, but all the dynamics we're going to talk about throughout this episode, I think, are all present in this example, and it's first in the chronology. So it's really like maybe the birth of of all of this. So take it away.
Sure. No, thank you. And I mean, one of the things that I think we're going to emphasize throughout this episode is that these are as much global conflicts as they are national conflicts and even regional conflicts. So it'll be really interesting how, not just Europe, but other parts of the world continue to come back into our conversation. And so on that point, one of the things that my work does, it's a transnational history, right? And Rob and I discussed this in the first episode of our podcast. What is transnational history versus global history, et cetera? Basically, transnational history is a history that looks at processes that transcend borders, that don't really know national boundaries, but that still affect national developments. So not just, maybe something like immigration, for example, could be part of transnational history, globalization, economic flows, cultural dynamics, religion, imperialism, all that could fit into transnational history. And so, and what transnational history tries to do is it tries to really challenge and question the idea of the nation state and how much it's actually a national history versus just something that's happening throughout the world. So what I study is basically kind of the Mexican version of a broader movement that's happening around the world, not just in Latin America, but also in the U.S. and Europe, especially in the Catholic world in the 20th century, is going through a lot of really important conversations and changes. So my work is transnational history of what I call counter-revolutionary Mexico, so the Catholic opposition to the Mexican Revolution. Specifically, I study the relationship between Mexico, the United States, and Spain, because I think those two countries, specifically the U.S. and Spain, are very much relevant to anything that happens in Mexico anytime in history, because they're the two more powerful influences shaping domestic dynamics, right? Spain being the colonizer and the U.S. being the northern neighbor and the new colonizer after the 19th century. And so my work is looking at these Catholic networks that are trying to forge like a unified opposition to the Mexican Revolution, because the Mexican Revolution is seen as this embodiment of a lot of things that Catholicism was very afraid of, particularly communism. Even though the Mexican Revolution starts in 1910, which is 7 years before the Soviet Revolution of 1917, the new constitution in Mexico, the 1917 constitution, draws from a lot of European socialist influences, a lot of Bismarckian influences. And with the Soviet Revolution happening in the background of this too, there's a fear by the Catholic Church that these two revolutions happening together could lead to the spread of communism around the world, right? And so Rob and I did another episode on this, on revolutions. So you should check it out if you have a chance. And so basically what happens is that the Catholic Church begins to mobilize in the 1920s, particularly after World War I. They begin to mobilize ideologically. They begin to move money and channel different financial networks to fight different wars throughout the world. And so the Cristero War is one of them. It's kind of like a proxy war, if you want to call it that. I actually argue that it's one of the first kind of Cold War conflicts in the world. And the church is basically going to double down on its anti-communist discourse, on its conservatism, and it's going to take a very hardline approach to anything that it considers to be socialist or communistic or something of that sort. So in Mexico, what happens is the revolution, the fighting ends around 1920. Well, the mass fighting ends around 1920. But because there's this new constitution in power that has all these anti-clerical provisions, that is promoting secular public education, that is put forth by the state, that it's limiting the clergy's political power, it's limiting public worship. The church already, after 1917, begins to funnel a lot of money into Mexico to fund Catholic opponents to the state. The Mexican government, on the other hand, is very conscious of this. There's a lot of espionage that happens at this time, and they're very worried about what this means for sovereignty, because even before the revolution, sovereignty was one of the big questions, right? Like, what's going to happen if all these foreign capitalist interests get a hold of Mexican resources and land, etc., right? And have also influence in politics. So there's already kind of an antagonism taking place. And what happens then, the Cristero Rebellion is an explosion of violence when all of these tensions come to a crescendo. It lasts for 3 years, but really it's kind of one portion of a longer story of counter-revolution that actually maybe begins in Mexico, but then spreads throughout the world, particularly into places like Spain during the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, other parts of Europe, I'm sure, and also parts of the United States and Latin America as well. So my work is basically just tracing the outlines of that and how it connects to the broader world, right? So that's how kind of it's moving into this chronology.
So on that point, there's a real Wikipedia nerd hours, but if you ever look up battles or wars on Wikipedia, there's like the belligerent section on the side, and you get like the long list of...
Yeah, we got the starting lineup.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole... Yeah. And it used to be there. I'm looking right now. I think someone removed it, but it used to be on the Cristero War. I guess the English language Wikipedia. On one side, under the Cristeros, was the Knights of Columbus, and on the other side,
it's a specific battle you have to look up.
On the other side, under the Mexican government, is the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah,
and I would like to clarify, just because you're talking about
batting fourth.
He's the premier hitter. I saw him at the home run derby this year, the KKK. And just everything you're talking about, Ricky, like how does the KKK and Knights of Columbus fit in here? Like why does Catholicism, or how does it take on this political issue? Like, I mean, just as one example.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So going back to the triangular relationship that I was talking about between Mexico, Spain, and the U.S., right? So what we have to understand about the Cristero Rebellion in the 1920s is that for many Catholic activists, not just in Mexico, but outside of Mexico, the Cristero Rebellion was seen as kind of like the last best hope of undoing and even toppling the Mexican Revolution and the revolutionary government. There had been a Catholic-backed counter-revolution earlier during the war in 1914, but that was unsuccessful. It only lasted for about a year and a half. And it was also supported by the U.S. government, by Woodrow Wilson. But ever since then, there really hadn't been an organized mass opposition to the revolutionary state. If anything, the state had been trying to grow its influence and strength. So the Cristero Rebellion is seen as like, okay, maybe this is the last hope, right? So what happens is that a lot of interest groups, some of them religious conservatives, others just capitalist interests in the U.S. and other parts of the world, begin to funnel a lot of money and arms and munitions into the Cristero Rebellion, arming Catholic rebels, right? So the Knights of Columbus, so this first part of the question, the Knights of Columbus being a U.S. Catholic organization, a fraternal society that's founded in the 1880s in New Haven, Connecticut, of all places, which is where Yale is, where I study.
powerful energy to that city.
Yeah, I know, right? No, I mean, like
Where Rory Gilmore studied, okay?
Yeah, it's where my son was born, right? It was where George W. Bush was born, right? All that. There's some dark energy around there, but there's also some. There's also some light.
It's going to be the Paul Atreides of the future Catholic empire of the world.
It's like Exegol. That's what it is, right? New Haven. New Haven is like that Sith planet. But basically,
it's called Korriban, okay? Get it right.
sorry, I'm going with the Disney Kathleen Kennedy trilogies here, right? The very much loved
Well,
Disney
it's called
trilogies.
Moribon, okay? Fine, whatever. Yeah.
So, so what happens is the Knights of Columbus are very much an organization that is working with these interests because a lot of its members, there's a board, there's a president, there's all these trustees, very powerful people. They're very powerful people in American society. Particularly, they're involved in banking, they're involved in oil, right? Many of them are based in New York, others are based in Texas, in the border. Right? I mean, if you think about Knights of Columbus, they're kind of like these Irish immigrant descendants. Because Father McGivney, who started this whole thing in the 1880s, I mean, these were like the first waves of Irish. But by the 1920s, we're talking about their children and grandchildren in some cases who have made a very prominent reputation for themselves economically, right? So they're very powerful players, both in the U.S. and the world. So they're moving all this money, and they're also trying to push the U.S. government to intercede and intervene on the side of the Cristeros, militarily and economically. So they're really pushing the, who would it be at this point? The Coolidge administration. And people like Frank Kellogg, the Secretary of State, and the ambassador, right, Sheffield, and then Morrow. They're really pushing them to either intercede on behalf of the Cristeros or at the very least try to come up with some sort of compromise that benefits U.S. oil interests in Mexico. On the flip side, the Knights of Columbus, the KKK, they're, as we know, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant. They've been around also since the late 1800s. And they see this conflict in Mexico, and they want it to end for two reasons. Number one is because they're opposed to any sort of Catholic activism in the U.S., and they see the Cristero Rebellion as kind of strengthening the cause of the Knights of Columbus at home in the United States, because the Knights of Columbus, when the Cristero Rebellion breaks out, they start organizing labor, they start organizing immigrant communities to kind of fundraise for these efforts and to kind of politically mobilize to petition governments. And the KKK doesn't like that. It doesn't like to see Catholics mobilize for any reason. So they're afraid, number one, that this is going to be something that the Knights are going to use to grow their power at home. But number two, they're seeing that the Cristero Rebellion is also influencing a lot of Mexican immigration to the United States. Particularly in the 1920s, a lot of these immigrants who are arriving in cities like Chicago, for example, right, where Rob and I met and went to college, California, the Southwest, Pennsylvania, the industrial Midwest, they're coming from the regions that are most affected by the fighting. So the KKK is looking at all this and they're saying, well, what is this war? Like, it's basically, feeding into the power of the Knights of Columbus here in the U.S., but it's also bringing all these immigrants from Mexico that we don't want, that we don't like, into American territory and American cities. So they're going to oppose the war, and they're going to actually petition the U.S. to help the Mexican government so that the war can end as quickly as possible, right? And as I was mentioning to Rob the other day, at that point, the Mexican government is trying to bring Protestant missionaries and Mormon missionaries into Mexico, #Mitt Romney, so that they can curb the power of the church locally.
Binders full of missionaries.
Yeah, so they're trying to bring them into Mexico to curb the religious influence of the church, right? So the KKK, is seeing this as a good thing. They're saying, well, maybe the Mexican government is also anti-Catholic, right? So that's why you see those two different sides, those two different players on the starting lineup in Wikipedia. Yeah.
I'm just imagining too, how many troops, or whatever, did they did the Knights of Columbus send any military help? I'm just because they have those ridiculous uniforms. Did they just go charging into battle with those? I mean, for those who don't know, mostly now the Knights of Columbus is the thing that your weird uncle is a part of, who's ancient. If you grew up in a Catholic household. So I'm just imagining just a bunch of really old guys who just would go they'd have their it'd be like once a month they'd be at mass. They would have their whole like deal on and whatnot.
Yeah.
I can't imagine them in any way as like mercenary.
They made some really good fish fries at my church. I remember that. They had like some good. They had some good fish fries. Yeah, they were good. Man. Yeah, and they had beer and like all that kind of stuff. Yeah,
we're getting back into Catholic hour here.
Yeah.
I want to move the story forward a little bit because there's a lot of overlaps here with something I know you research a lot, which is fascism, and specifically like fascism in the Catholic world, because the Cristero wars in the 20s. Mussolini's already risen to power by the in the early 20s. I think Calles, he was president in the 20s and 30s in Mexico, but he, like people say, maybe was like flirting with a kind of fascism, right? And you have obviously what's going on in Spain and other places. So how does this reaction, first of all, tie into the rise of fascism in the Catholic world? Yeah. And just as like a broader introduction, I know we talked about it on our episode, but for people who look at fascism mostly through the example of the Nazis, what is this whole other side of fascism, or how does it manifest in the Catholic world, and how is it similar? I mean, you don't have to tease out all the similarities and differences, but especially the main themes about a reaction to modernity, and things like that.
So those are some great questions, Rob. And so, and just to quickly answer Nick's question too, the Knights, they weren't sending troops necessarily, but they were sending a lot of weapons to Mexico, which is kind of crazy because there's some documents that are in the archives that you see where there's like all this money flowing, and there's all these exiled or retired generals on the border who are Mexican, but they don't like the government. They don't like Calles. And they're kind of these middlemen who are moving all of this ammunition into Mexico. Right. And it's like, our man in El Paso, he's doing this, or our guy in this person. Right. So it's really fascinating to see how this
Beto O'Rourke.
Oh, my God. Yeah. So it's funny because it reminds me.
On a tank as it rolls over the border.
Because this is really like this is why I call this like a Cold War conflict, because this is what's going to happen, in Central America and South America and the Caribbean, right, later in the century. So it begins in this moment in Mexico, and also Nicaragua is going through a civil war at this time too. So you see kind of these first Cold War-esque conflicts in the 20s. But to Rob's point about fascism, so in our episode on fascism, we went over different ways to think about fascism, different models of fascism, definitions, if you will. And it's funny because, as Rob said, we have a very kind of limited view here in the U.S., too, about what fascism is. People think about Nazi Germany, and they think about fascist Italy and Spain, and they kind of lump all those together, right? As I mentioned to you guys the other day, it's like all of these Lenin imitators gone wrong. Like, it's just this horrible, like, pro-American narrative that we get, right? And really, it misses a lot of nuance and a lot of complexity to fascism. And, it doesn't really go into how it survived even after World War II. It just kind of brands it as something that the United States fought against and defeated gloriously, and then it just kind of went away after 1945, right? And so what we talked about in that episode and how the Catholic Church fits into fascism is that even before World War I, even before someone like Mussolini, Catholic activists in places like Latin America and Catholic Europe, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Western Europe, are already inclined to some of these fascist movements because they've been mobilizing for maybe 30 or 40 years against the rise of secular states and secular modernity. So Rob and I discussed this. The revolutions of 1848 and then getting into the 1850s and 60s, right? Remember Vatican I, I think we talked about this. This is 1868 probably, I think it was the date. In the middle of the 1800s, there's this push to kind of bring back some of the legacies of the French Revolution in Europe and Latin America. So, because there's that conservative wave after Napoleon's defeat, and that kind of gets really challenged in the middle of the 1800s. And so, all of a sudden, different governments around the world begin to adopt these secular liberal constitutions that are really limiting the power of the Catholic Church. Mexico is one of them. In 1857, has a very controversial constitution that starts to really put the brakes on the Catholic Church. Very famously, the Pope at the time published a whole thing against the Mexican Constitution, saying that it was blasphemous and irreligious and atheistic, right? And some similar things are happening in Europe, and you guys know this, and you probably talked about it, right? In places like France and other countries. So Catholics are already mobilizing against what they see as this kind of liberal modern wave. And so they're already taking a lot of ideological positions that are setting them up for a future turn toward fascism. They're anti-liberal in some ways, anti-democratic, anti-capitalist somehow, not in the sense that they are communist or socialist, but they want to find kind of a third way alternative to regulate capitalism through some sort of intervention. And
sounds like this is forming around an ideology that forms then a little bit later in European history that we're kind of maybe not talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, and that's the thing. It was like a lot of these Catholics, they called this Catholic social doctrine. That was the name they gave it because they didn't want to call it socialism because they were afraid of that word because they thought it was atheistic and kind of like a slippery slope toward like communism. So basically, by the turn of the century, by the early 1900s, Catholics are threatened and opposed to a lot of things that modernity has come to represent. So they don't like industrialization, for example. They have this kind of nostalgia for this pre-industrial world that was kind of nationally pure, ethnically pure, religiously pure, ideologically pure. There's a very big, They have a very big fear of cosmopolitanism and big cities and big urban cities with a lot of immigrant populations, particularly Jewish populations, because they don't see them as really places where there could be any sort of morality. They look at urban culture, they look at dance and art and music and just interracial populations living together in very close proximity to each other, and they see this as kind of a hotbed for like promiscuity and sin. So there's a lot of Catholic reformers that, try to put the lid on it, and they're blaming modernity and urban modernity on this and secular modernity because they're saying, well, what's going on? Like, what happened to the old world where it was kind of a rural world and the church had all this power over the countryside and it really ruled over people's lives? So there's kind of like that threat of the church losing its power. And there's also, with World War I and the increased militarization of society, the church itself also becomes very militant and begins to mobilize different sectors of society in a way that, as I talked to Rob in the episode, it's kind of like a precursor to corporatism and the corporatist model of governance, where like you just kind of organize society into these big interest groups and you start moving them around for a specific purpose. So that is kind of an antithesis to individualism and kind of democracy based on the individual versus statecraft and state formation based on these massive groups of people that need to be militant and mobilized under what the state is trying to do. So this is why Catholic activists are already prone to a lot of the things that someone like a Mussolini is going to want to try to do by 1920. Right. And so with Mussolini specifically, like the social conservatism of his movement is really something that draws Catholic partisans. And I mentioned to Rob, right, like Italy is not necessarily a religious state by any means, because Mussolini does try to put a boundary between himself and the integralists, who are these Catholics that believe that all of society should be guided by moral principles, whether it's economic policy, public policy, foreign relations, everything should be guided by the principles of the Catholic Church. And so integralists really want to have something like a state religion and to have religion permeate all aspects of social life. And Mussolini's basically saying, no, like we're going to have a secular state and I'm going to be the head of it, because he wants to curb the power of the Pope in Italy, right? He even gives the Pope his own separate state, right? In the Lateran Accords. And so it's really interesting. So because you have this confluence of integralism, anti-democratic political movements that harken back to decades of Catholic organizing, by the time you get to the 1920s and 30s, Catholics are very much already playing this game, right? So the Soviet Revolution basically just gives them an excuse to amplify what they've already been doing for 40 years, right? Because now they're really talking about communism. And now it's not just secular modernity, but now it's like, oh, the Bolshevik threat of atheism and outlawing religion. And this is when they use that as a foil, as an other, to then just kind of up the ante, and just kind of really go all out in the, discursively in the language that they're using and the rhetoric of anti-communism. But even politically, right, they really begin to see something like in Latin America, indigenous mobilization, black politicization of black communities. They see that as subversive because they see these groups as leaning and tending toward the communist parties of different regions. So they really begin to preach a kind of politics that's very hierarchical, that's very anti-democratic, that's very racially oppressive, because they begin to use communism as kind of this catch-all term to lump all these different groups together and essentially argue for the preservation of elite power, white elite power in some cases, and really limit the possibilities of empowerment for other communities that have been previously marginalized. So this is like all coming together in a perfect storm of sorts, right? To put it that way. Yeah. Yeah, Rob, go ahead.
I think though,
yeah.
I think that too, like also at the same time as well. Like I know that we've mentioned Mussolini, and briefly the Nazis were name dropped. Also at this time too, there are Catholic nations or Christian nations that are adopting very explicit fascist like political tendencies that are just also openly, like the Austrofascism is just openly Catholic and openly fascist. You have the like Romanian Iron Guards. Well, okay, although they're Eastern Orthodox, I would say Eastern Orthodoxy is has far more in common with Catholicism politically and socially than it does to let's say like American like evangelical or what's the proper like Protestant tendencies and whatnot. And these like end up obviously later on either in the sense of Austrofascism just getting swallowed up by Germany when Austria is annexed, or in the case of the Iron Guard when the Nazis get to Romania, they're like, these guys are fucking more insane than we are, and just end up killing off half of the membership of the group and just kind of putting who they need in place of their puppet governments in place. So it is like, I know like Italy. Italy and Germany are obviously, the big names, the superstars, the like of fascism and Nazism of the 20s and 30s. But there is like there are like some little like pockets of this really like religious fascism that do like take hold.
For
so
sure.
It was like it never is like this example, at least to my knowledge, at least, that there is like a complete removal of like religious groups and
of course, yeah,
actual political fascism.
Yeah, and I mean something we're going to talk about in a second, like when we get to the post-war order and Pius XII. I mean, Croatia is another example of.
Oh yeah, I forgot about Croatia.
And Ustaza. But
yeah,
I guess what I see you two maybe kind of gesturing towards is that like it's maybe like typical to say, I don't know, that religion becomes like this, or Catholicism becomes this outdated thing that's being superseded by new ideologies like Nazism and Bolshevism that like replace it. But it's almost like at this time of great change is exactly when things like Catholicism come back as kind of a, I mean, in Eastern Europe to like as an
don't call it a comeback, Rob.
Excuse me. As a form of state building or nation building, like that it's always present, or at least religion in general is always present at this transition between like, I don't know, old world and new world. How that even the fact that there's like a change in the world to be negotiated. I mean, it reminds me of Marx's quote. You mentioned Vatican I. I mean, that time period, I don't know if he's talking about the Catholic Church specifically, but there's a reason he says the criticism of religion is the precondition or the prerequisite for all criticism. I mean, from his point of view, in that like this is how understanding the world totality is structured, and so that's why it's the beginning of any kind of I mean, for a Marxist critique to go, to try to understand how that totality changes and develops. So I mean, religion is central to all of this.
I agree, and I think to yours and Nick's point. So another part of this Catholic militancy, I mean, I talked about anti-Semitism as this kind of reaction to cosmopolitanism and kind of the figure of the Jew as like this, person without a nation who just lives in the city and steals money and whatever, But another branch of this Catholic activism is also anti-Protestantism, and precisely because they look at something like liberalism and secular liberalism, and at least in my sources that I'm looking at in Mexico, they always call it kind of this descendant of Anglo-Protestantism. And so that's another part of that Catholic militancy, is saying something like liberal democracy, right, is itself a creation of Britain and the United States, precisely because it's trying to relegate religion to the private sphere. and that's why it's seen as like not working within Catholicism. Yeah, and to Rob's point, with religion and how religion is always there, it's kind of important for us to think about the fact that in the 1920s and 30s, we living in 2020, we always see them as like the precursor to World War II. But people who lived there, they didn't know that that was going to happen, right? We know this, and so for them, it was like it was an unprecedented time. A lot of people thought it was the end of the world. It was very millenarian, right? They had just fought this horrible war. They never imagined there was going to be another war just like it or worse. So for them, it was like, well, this is religion's response to all of this. It's kind of becoming more militant, becoming more conservative, right? And really trying to coalesce people around these messages of religious uniformity, ideological uniformity, right? And racial uniformity in some cases. Because they thought, well, we can't have skepticism, we can't have differences, we can't have, because that's what led to all this conflict in the first place. So let's kind of just narrow down, right? And that's where a lot of these fascist tendencies come from. So, yeah, I mean, I just wanted to answer those 2 points. We can move on, though. I don't know if you guys want to talk about Spain or you want to talk about other parts of Europe, but yeah, I'm up for wherever you want to take the conversation.
I think I want to transition to now. I think that's a pretty good historical and theoretical background for what I want to talk about, which is basically the Pope and the Vatican from 1945 through. I don't know about today, but through the 20th century.
Today, yeah, very much. Like, Francis is very much like a part of this whole thing. It's just like we don't want to pretend that he is.
So I'll throw it over to Nick then and say, who is Pius XII?
Okay, well, first, war happens. Wasn't that a doozy? 1945, the Axis lose. Yeah, the world has to, have a new order, if you will. Including the Catholic Church, because they fucking did a lot of horrible shit during World War II that they just have been denying literally until this year.
So wait, explain that. So
I will. Don't
it's
worry.
like the CIA, like they have to release the documents after a certain number of years. It's a Catholic Church. Can't they do what they want? Like never release anything?
I don't know like the specifics of it, but this year they started releasing some of the documents about what the Catholic Church was doing during World War II, and the Pope during this was Pope Pius XII. And briefly, we touched on anti-Semitism, obviously, and how there was the Catholic Church. Actually, this was this may seem kind of weird to people who don't know, but if you've seen The Passion of the Christ, then you are very much aware of the fact of Catholic anti-Semitism is still very much a thing.
For sure.
The official doctrine of the church now is obviously that anti-Semitism is bad. They wrote this though in the 50s. Anti-Semitism was still officially seen as like a thing because of the teaching, more not official or unofficial, it doesn't really matter, but Catholics still even till today hold the belief that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. Not the fact that Jesus had to die, or that this is part of some kind of like whole part of the plan, that the Romans killed him or whatever. It's like, no. The Jews the one who turned Jesus over, and that's where a lot of this anti-Semitism.
It reminds me of this photo I saw today, just a photo taken of a bumper sticker, which is if Jesus had a gun, he'd still he would have lived. Which is but I thought he was supposed to die. I thought that was the whole.
That's the whole point. Yeah, exactly. But then they still have
exactly.
to they're still pissed about something that then was even foretold. And yes, there is a material reason for then why the anti-Semitism comes because of as you mentioned, but there is also then a slight doctrine that then backs it up too, that then is seen as the blame of the death of Jesus, which has to happen in order for the prophecy of Jesus to come true. Nonetheless, Pope Pius XII was kind of there's a mixed. It's like a mixed bag with him, because up until recently, the Catholic Church kind of tried to promote him as a reformer, because he is the Pope during the transition. He is during this transitional period of what becomes Vatican II, but. So there was this, the official thing of the Catholic Church that they tried to help the Jews escape, and that they, had, help people flee from the ghetto, the Jews flee from the ghettos of Rome. When the reality is, I think a handful of people survived. All the rest of them ended up either in concentration camps or being killed. Yeah. And the Pope had very much a kind of like a U.S. approach to World War II. I think because we were talking about this yesterday, of that then America likes pretending that they were these like the triumphant, always anti-fascist in their actions, this and that and that.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't really until 1943 with the invasion of Sicily and 1944 with the invasion of Normandy that the United States even enters the European theater, while the Soviet Union had been fighting since 1940, sorry, pushing. Increasingly weakening the German military, and then the British and Americans, the British after just being completely embarrassed throughout the majority of World War II, to strike back with the U.S. and do that. But the Catholic Church definitely had, and under Pope Pius, I would argue, at least maybe you can correct me, Ricky, about a very similar approach of that. Then we're just going to kind of like they knew that the Holocaust was happening.
Oh yeah.
Didn't do anything about it, and then kind of now have the thing of like, look at the 8 people that we helped. Like, isn't that great?
A lot of them actually even openly supported the Holocaust. I mean, you're talking. Yeah. I mean, I think this happens in Latin America. Like, a lot of these Catholic militants are like Nazis. They like the Nazis, right? They're saying, "Oh, look at them. They're trying to unify in the way that we should unify our own nation, right? What based on racial uniformity." Religious and ideological uniformity, right? There's all this anti-Semitism also in Latin America, as we talked about earlier. Anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, right? So yeah, for sure. I mean, a lot of them are like openly praising this, and I think with Latin America specifically, because Franco in Spain is also allying with Hitler in these ways. They see this as just something that's so natural, right? Because they're looking up to Franco as like this hero of Hispanism, and look at him, right? He created a state, right? For 15 years before the Spanish Civil War, Spain had been trying to create this state that like was religiously uniform, and Franco kind of perfects this in the eyes of Catholics, right? He embodies this, and so they're saying, and look, he sees Hitler as an ally, so therefore, like, hey, like he is someone who is also trying to carry out a similar mission. So for sure, I mean, none of this really surprises me at all, unfortunately.
You mentioned the Allies and the church. I do see it. It's almost like there's like a 1-to-1 example of every like bad thing the Allies did, like not really being against the fascists. The church did too. Like like concentration camps being like, that's bad, but that's not our top priority. And then also like Operation Paperclip, like taking all the German scientists. Like the church was like doing the Vatican rat line, sending all the Ustaza to South America. Like it lines up pretty well.
One of the weirdest things about it too is that then the Catholic Church, like Pope Pius Pope Pius XII, in some cases just like blatantly just denies the Holocaust. One of the weirdest things of it is that like there were a lot of Catholics who were sent to concentration camps. Either that then because of the religious aspect, or because some Catholic priests aligned themselves with anti-Nazi resistant groups and whatnot. It's pretty wild though that there are just some of these quotes from there's like one that just comes off my head that I read in researching this, where Pope Pius says that the Jews are just notorious for over-exaggerating and whatnot, which is insane to think of.
Jesus.
Especially when there's these wires coming through of then like, not even just like Christian persecution, but very specifically Catholic persecution that then is also happening alongside all this other political and religious persecution, extermination at the hands of the Nazis. It's so just mind-blowing to me, but
I know people who still say that shit like today. So it's just like, oh my god. Yeah. So anyway, you're saying, yeah.
Well, I just want to bring up something else because we're talking about Pope Pius XII. One thing that I know him for is the 1949 Decree Against Communism, the Catholic Church document approved by Pope Pius XII, which declares Catholics who profess communist doctrine to be excommunicated as apostates from the Christian faith. Listeners of our show,
am I automatically excommunicated then?
I don't know. I think I have to like do it, like, because
you gotta do communism.
No, well, there's a list. Yeah, exactly, dude. The Catholic Church is owning you as an online poser, dude. Because I think.
Nick, where's your communist revolution, huh?
There's
you
a list. You
want to be excommunicated?
There's a list of bishops who are excommunicated. Listeners of the show will be happy to know that I am just reading this off of Wikipedia, but that the Pope started to develop this document immediately after the 1948 Italian elections, in which the Italian Communist Party received 31% of the vote. Only 31% of the vote.
Does the Pope have a Gladio connection, big dog?
I'm sure. Yeah,
Probably,
I'm sure.
yeah.
So, I mean, is there anything that we want to say about the Cold War? I mean, about communism in general before we get to Vatican II and the Catholic Church?
So I think
Catholics didn't like communism.
yeah,
That's not true,
Exactly.
actually, but yeah.
Well, like, I mean, you talked about it a little bit, Ricky, but what is something I want to get into in the rest of the episode is sort of what form we've talked about the Catholic Church kind of representing a right-wing politics or trying to form one. And what form does that take over time? So immediately after World War II, it seems to be like very closely aligned with, Western Europe and this anti-communist ideology that can kind of cohere a new social order.
I think to your question, Rob, I think the church really takes anti-communism and the official church, and that's I think what I want to get into is that one thing is what the Vatican is saying and doing, and kind of putting out there as the official message. But then it's a very different story if you look at what actual religion looks like on the ground and what people are doing, right? Whether it's in rural towns in Latin America or parts of East Asia or Africa. And I think that's exactly what we're getting at. And this is, I think, a good lead up to to Vatican II, is that I think part of this anti-communist line that comes from the church, I use the word integralism, which I think is big in Catholic circles, but I think the other word that we should talk about is Romanization. Romanization is this idea that the church is in 20th century, kind of this movement within the church to make sure that every single Catholic diocese, archdiocese, parish is, top to bottom aligned with the doctrines that are promoted officially by the Vatican. Because what had been happening over the course of the 1800s is that a lot of rural communities, a lot of parishes and local priests had allowed for the flourishing of popular religious traditions. And actually, one of the reasons why the Cristero Rebellion in Mexico is unsuccessful, the Spanish government at the time refuses to support the Cristeros because they don't think of them as being Catholic enough, because they're these indigenous peasants who have these popular forms of religiosity, and they're looking at these martyrs of the war, and they're like venerating them like saints, and they're thinking, who are these crazy Indians, right? I mean, there's a lot of racism here, a lot of paternalism. And so the Spanish government under Primo de Rivera, who was, Francisco Franco's boss in the 1920s, right? He's basically saying, these aren't real Catholics. Like, why are we going to get mixed up in this conflict if these people, these brown-skinned, indigenous people.
These hip-hop Catholics with their pants sagging.
Exactly. They're just like, they're just taking any schmuck of everyday life, and they're like praising him as a saint. Like, this isn't really Catholicism.
Oh, like the fucking Catholic Church doesn't already do that to begin with. Come on.
Exactly, right? And so that's the point. The Romanization is this idea where, well, you know what? We're going to align everything now. Like, we're going to bring everything together. Everything is going to emanate from the Vatican. It's going to be very top-down. And Romanization is really popular at the beginning of the 20th century, particularly the 20s and 30s, too, the period that I study. And so I think anti-communism is part of this story because anything that is not aligned with the Vatican is just dismissed as communist. So if you have indigenous peasants or Asian peasants, in places like Vietnam or whatever, who are worshiping in a specific way, or in the Philippines, they're dismissed as just like, oh, they're just communist agitators. Oh, they're not following the true faith. Oh, they're just being corrupted by like all these modern influences or whatever, right? And so anti-communism becomes this catch-all term for the church to promote its own projects of Romanization, right? Aligning faith all over the world, and integralism, which is basically, we're in every country, so let's make sure that every country has policies and governments in place that flow from Catholic principles. So anti-communism is kind of the vehicle for all of these things to be spread into the world. And so the church really loves anti-communism for this matter. Like, they see it as like, oh, this is a way for us to pursue our project without actually labeling it as a religious project. It could just be an anti-communist project, and we can have all these allies, who are going to back us up.
I just, on a really random note, I was looking up, speaking of Catholics like having a fucking patron saint for everything.
Yeah.
I was very curious if at this time they made a patron saint for fascism. They kind of did and kind of didn't. I guess they just proclaimed that St. Francis of Assisi is the patron saint of fascism. But fascism,
crazy.
not the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
could be the patron saint of podcasting one day.
I hope I'm the patron saint of podcasting. I have to have 2 miracles though, so like that's
Um, so you've already talked about it, Ricky. I mean, you said that this is such a attractive ideology or practice for the Catholic Church. But then what leads to the Vatican II reforms? I mean, like 10, 15 years later. I mean, and I mean the roots of that were already present. It seems like in the 50s. So why the shift?
Because I guess they finally realized it wasn't working. And I think we talked about this at some point in our episode too, Rob. But I think in Latin America, I think the Cuban Revolution and the civil wars in Guatemala were really eye-opening for the church, because it was like, look, we're trying here, like we're trying to, be anti-communist, but it's not working. Like people are really drawn to these, socialist movements, and rightfully so, right? I mean, we're talking about a region of the world that's been colonized for centuries, and even after independence, there's neocolonialism, and elites are still oppressing, right? Indigenous populations, workers, Afro-descendant populations, women. So there is this huge movement in Latin America toward, socialist movements, communist parties, etc. And so the Catholic Church begins to understand that it needs to change its strategy to be able to effectively challenge communism in terms of winning the hearts and minds of people, right? And so I think Vatican II is kind of a changing of course, because a lot of things that happened in Vatican II, when it would have never happened, I think 50 years earlier, or even 100 years earlier, right? And so I think it's important for us to kind of situate it, because it's also, I mean, there's similar movements happening in Africa and East Asia, right? Whether it's the wars of independence that have these huge players who are part of communist parties and socialist movements, right? They're also, I mean, the Catholic Church is seeing its presence in those regions and saying, well, we got to adopt and tailor our strategy here because we're losing ground. And I think Vatican II is a way that the church tries to open. But I think to Nick's point, I think what goes wrong in Vatican II is that a lot of priests were already communist or socialist. And so this is just like, okay, well, you know what? I'm just going to go for it. And so, particularly in Latin America, a lot of priests coming out of the Vatican II generation, they begin to mobilize their communities in new ways that the church would have never approved of. And a lot of them do get excommunicated, and they get, labeled as terrorists or, just like evil, whatever. So
get murdered by U.S. death squads.
Exactly, right? The CIA, right? So I think, I think Vatican II is a kind of a move, a trying, an attempt to kind of turn a corner. But did it really, right? And I think that's the question, because there's a lot of changes that do happen, and we can talk about those, I think, and Nick was mentioning them the other day. But there's also a lot of things that stay the same, unfortunately, when it comes to like the actual hierarchy of the church and like, how it functions and what the popes especially are trying to do. So,
all right, I want to ask about this specifically as a Catholic noob. So, what is the difference between the Vatican I and Vatican II services and churches?
Yeah, there was it was, first off, the church language was Latin for everything.
Mm-hmm.
So you would literally have like what is it called, ecclesiastic Latin? There was a specific language, like there was a specific version of Latin that you would even have that was the church approved Latin, because remember, Latin had pretty much been deceased for a few hundred years before, or like if was used, was in an academic sense as well, in like European academia before that. But no, I mean, like you had Latin, Mass was in Latin. You had a lot more kneeling just in general. You also had too that the method of how the priest would then address the just like smaller things too, that then the altar had to be at a certain spot, and the priest would then face back, like his back would be turned towards the people, so that which actually makes more sense when you think about it, because the priest is offering up, it to God. You weren't allowed to touch the Eucharist before, so the body and blood of Jesus, you physically weren't allowed to. The priest would have to give it to you. Vatican II said that you can. Like little small things like that, but women had to cover their heads. So if you ever go to a Latin Mass in the United States, you'll see people come with what look like
veils,
like doilies or veils and stuff like that, like into church. and they like remain that way the entire time because they like the Catholic Church actually had, at least for women, a relatively similar thing to how Judaism had it, that you have to enter a house of God with a head covering, and
Like
then
Islam
Vatican
too. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, true. Yeah, Islam has the exact same thing. So Vatican II changed that to become more, I guess, quote unquote, modern in that sense. But there's a lot of people who still like that, and I don't even think that that's like that weird that they think that those are like cool, because they are really interesting, and it, to me at least, seems much more like ritualistic. If you're gonna go and then spend 2 hours of your week this, like, it is far more interesting than just getting like a good timey
Eating
quite
pizza
Protestant.
and playing rock band
Yeah,
with Pastor
exactly.
Matt.
Well, under Vatican I, it was strictly cheese pizza, but Vatican II, you could get up and
Hawaiian
big
pepperoni.
But really, at least just like from my personal perspective, I can understand it when people like the ritual of the Latin Mass, because it is very. I mean, like there is too like the it's hard to imagine, but it also like Vatican II also changed, like reformed the church in the sense of like just like with the splendors of the Vatican. I mean, hard to imagine with how ridiculously wealthy the church is.
Right.
But I think it's finally coming into sense with like Pope Francis being probably the first pope ever to like be more frugal with his presentation and whatnot in comparison to his predecessors, who were just like blinged out, looking like a like a Greek Orthodox priest. I think Armani or Versace used to make the slippers for the for the Pope.
Oh yeah. I thought it was Gucci. It was one of those. Yeah, it was
one of
those.
them. Yeah, and like Pope Francis was the first one actually to be like, well, priest has to take a vow of poverty. I'm going to kind of go back to that. Yeah, obviously he still lives in like in Vatican City. He lives in just pure gold, but there is then this sense of, I think, finally like there still wasn't this complete realization of what these reforms meant, even until now, with the sense of how and Pope Benedict XVI is 100% an example of how conservative the church was and still is. Like, he has a massive following within the current like order of cardinals and stuff like that, because they think that Francis is too liberal when he reality isn't. But no, I mean, it's this ever changing thing within the church still that then is also having a lot of backlash still currently.
So is Pope Francis like? Is he Cory Booker, or is he like, or is he Bernie Sanders? Like, what is? What? There's not Bernie.
We're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, So I still don't.
No, we have to go with another Catholic. He's Pete Buttigieg.
Oh, wait, yeah, but wait, Rob. Let me just follow up on the point on Vatican II, though, because this goes to your question. I think of all the things that Nick mentioned, which all of it obviously is correct. I mean, all that stuff happened. I think the biggest, most monumental change is the language, at least in Latin America and multiracial societies around the world. I think the fact that you can have mass in someone's vernacular language, and have a more kind of direct communication between priests and the people who are there, I think that was huge. Because one thing that I want to put in perspective for a lot of our listeners who might not be familiar with the region is, even by the 1960s, which is like yesterday, right? Like, I mean, my parents were alive in the 60s and stuff. A lot of communities in Latin America specifically, they didn't even speak Spanish or Portuguese. They spoke indigenous languages. The governments and the church had to do a really thorough effort to try to get these people to even speak the official languages of the country. And even today, they still don't speak them. So to have a priest who is able to deliver a message that is in some local indigenous language that people can really understand, to let them kind of have that freedom, I think really was important for mobilizing people and for creating openings for change. And one thing that I did mention to you guys, I think it was just a quick anecdote. When I was in Ecuador last summer with students, we went to this town called Salinas, and we learned about how in the 60s and 70s, after Vatican II, this Italian priest who came to the town started preaching liberation theology and kind of empowering people to embark on these paths of like social change, to the point where, like, within the span of 20 or 30 years, the town went from like the stereotypical like mud huts and like the big houses of like the wealthy elites, and now it's like everybody owns the factory. People have access to like the profits that they make from, they sell cheese and chocolate and textiles, I think are the biggest commodities that they export. So, that is huge. Like the fact that you can say that the church had a role in moving the people in the avenue of change. It's just one of the examples of things that would happen in after Vatican II that were no way that were going to happen before Vatican II. So in some cases, you could say that it inspired changes, but in others, I mean, I think we can argue that there were still a lot of things that didn't change. So.
Yeah. I think that's funny that you mentioned that because of Catholicism, this community ends up kind of like more or less in like a some form of like a socialist or at least like a syndicalist sort of formation. One of the things that's so funny to me is that because obviously like from growing up in Catholicism, hearing then like how it's taught, how this and that, obviously like the teachings of Jesus and like some form of liberation theory, line up a lot. One of the funniest things I suggest all of our listeners to do is to look up the like Catholic.org's definition of communism on their site, because one, it's probably the best definition and the most detailed definition of communism, and two, they then have to very specifically tell you why Catholicism is in no way communist, and they do a very horrible job of doing that.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I didn't know. I didn't know there was something on the website. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this brings me to what we were talking about before, which is I've always heard, of course, I've heard of John Paul II, but I don't really know who he was, other than the fact that he was, worked for the CIA and was helping end communism in the East, in his native Poland. But yesterday, it struck me that everything you guys are explaining, and I think even what you're saying now fits into it, is that he is the Obama Pope. Like he's like the swag Pope, like internationally super popular. The first non-Italian in however many years,
500.
Right?
Yeah.
But to me, what I'm interested in him is how he introduces a new kind of conservatism or right-wing politics to the church, and maybe you guys can disagree, under these new conditions, post-Vatican II. I mean, kind of what people talk about, like to reincorporate maybe like resistance movements. Maybe there's nothing to resist. I mean, if it's a thriving syndicalist community, but to me, it seems like you could argue the Catholic Church reincorporates kind of elements that we're seeking, to overthrow it or end communist movements and things like that. So what do you guys think of John Paul II? Is this assessment right, wrong?
I guess I'm just going to quickly go and just because I mentioned Joseph Ratzinger for a quick minute, aka Pope Benedict XVI. I think that the biggest proof of that is how he was his right-hand man. And like you mentioned, John Paul II is Polish Obama, as you called him earlier, which I think is pretty great. And this idea then of like of him being this kind of larger than life. I mean, he was immediately beatified and immediately canonized, which for some people is like a 200 or 300 year process. And
so that's just rough to think about. Like, you are the word of God on the planet, and then they're still like, I don't know, we're thinking 200, 300 years, not sure if you'll...
Yeah, like Joan of Arc took 450 years for her to be...
She fucking burned.
Yeah, it took...
Damn, that's tough critics.
But it's really the sense that then John Paul II within the Catholic... At least this is just from my perspective. Like, I mean, he was the Pope I more or less grew up with, and I have the most... probably like the best memory of, because when I stopped going to church, it was like Benedict XVI was Pope, and he was pretty sus, and he has a horrible reputation now. But a lot of the politic is quite similar of the two, and I think it's very unfair then when people go and point to just because John Paul II's legacy is that like he helped Reagan break the Berlin Wall down, whatever the fuck it is, that just complete. Anti-materialist analysis of how the Soviet Union collapsed. Also very much responsible for just covering up a lot of the pedophilia stuff, just not a good dude. Let's just say that. And I guess Ricky probably knows way more than I do about John Paul II. But he, like every Catholic, will just tell you that he's like the best. And they just don't really know why. They'll just be like, he's there, and he is nice, and I like him.
This does make Ratzinger Joe Biden, by the way.
Exactly, yeah. Benedict XVI, who's still, like, like his whole new thing right now is insane amounts of Islamophobia. Like he continuously,
it's not funny, but
he's just been like, he writes so fucking much because he's in exile technically, but he still has a massive following, and it's his like number one thing is about how like the Islamic world is gonna like take over again and stuff like that.
So I'm just imagining him on like a Ben Shapiro style radio show where he's just going off, and then it's like
90-year-old Nazi.
The Pope? Like, what, how did you get to this? Like, you should have.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think with John Paul II, one thing that's super important to just remember about him is, besides the fact that he was the first non-Italian pope in however many centuries, he was also the first pope to leave the Vatican and go to different countries. Most notably, Mexico is one of the countries that he goes to, if not the first country that he goes to outside of Italy, in the 1970s. And precisely one of the first places he goes, and the last place he went on his last visit, was the site of a monument to Jesus Christ that's in the central state of Guanajuato, which was really famous because it was one of the things that triggered the Cristero Rebellion in the first place. Because the Mexican
he's doing the Franco thing where he just like puts his mausoleum where all the what's it called, like where all the resistance fighters were buried and whatnot.
Well, but that's the thing with John Paul II is like, so he goes to these very symbolic sites in Catholic countries, specifically in Mexico, and he kind of gets close to the people. And so I think one of the reasons why everyday people have this like really amazing image of him is because they actually got to see him in person, and like for them that was like very spiritually meaningful and whatever, and like people remember it, and people like have photographs, and like some people even shook his hand. And so I think that's where like the cultural image of like the Obama-esque image comes in, right? And I think a lot of people are really, emotionally just like, and this is a different generation. This is not my generation. I never saw him, but I know my parents are part of that generation. I know my aunts and uncles.
My
are
mom
part of that
saw
generation.
Pope John Paul II. Yeah,
dude, like I had an electrician who was at my house when I was 15 years old remodeling our kitchen. And he and my parents talked for hours about John Paul II coming over because he was Catholic, and it's just like the most, like, I still remember this guy. His name was Scott, the electrician, and he was like talking to my parents for hours about just John Paul. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, John Paul too. Like, so I think also like in an Obama sense too, as well. Like John Paul literally did like a stadium tour in the United States. Of saying mass. He said mass at Yankee Stadium. He said mass. Really? Yeah, he said. I swear to God, in the 70s, he said mass at Yankee Stadium. He said mass at Sun Devil Stadium.
Yeah,
which was incredibly controversial actually, because they had to like cover up all of the Sparky the Sun Devil logos at ASU because it's the devil, baby.
Yeah, exactly.
And so he like not only John Paul II, Barack Obama, and also maybe the first like hair metal pope, if you will.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think this is the aura of celebrity, which Rob is an expert on, right? And so Rob talks about celebrity and spectacle all the time, and I think this is part of it. And so I think that's where we get like the kind of the everyday people grassroots appeal. But I will say, like, we do have to, thinking of him as like a historical figure and like what he did or did not do and like how he was aligned with different movements. I think it's right. I mean, he was definitely conservative. He's a pope, like, right? But also to the point where I remember very controversially, like he would go to Cuba and meet with Fidel Castro, and I don't know whether or not that was like actually substantive, materially speaking, if it was just him like doing some sort of symbolic gesture, but he was like still on these anti-communist tropes, trying to walk away from them a little bit after the fall of the Soviet Union. But it's still there.
He's a graceful winner.
Yeah, exactly, right. And the thing is, internally though, with the church, within the church, I should say, he did, like Nick is saying, like he covered up a lot of pedophilia. I don't know why. Like, I mean, because actually it was Ratzinger who
why did Obama bail out the banks? I don't know.
Yeah, exactly, right. Like, yeah, like I mean, and so really
Wall
famously,
Street and Vatican, lots of pedophiles.
I mean, really, like, I think, Francis, no, sorry, not Francis, Benedict was the one who really kind of put the axe on a lot of the pedophile rings. And in Mexico, it was funny because, there was this huge ring of pedophiles who called themselves the Legionaries of Christ. And, they had this movement in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And actually, really interestingly, one of my own like relatives, she was not a victim of anything, but she was like a nun. Like she was converted. Like she went and she did missionary work. Like she's out of that now. Like she's married and has like 3 kids or whatever. But I mean, this movement was like in everybody's lives, and it wasn't until the 2000s. When Ratzinger takes over, that he's like, you know what? Like this guy who was the leader of this was a huge pedophile, and like there's all these instances of child abuse, etc. So really, he begins to like clean house within the church, and so I think that was one of the biggest flaws of John Paul II, which is not doing enough. I think if you look at him though in the context of like intra-Catholic politics, like within the church, like the Pope before him was pretty much, I think, killed by the mob. I mean, he was poisoned. And so he was
Pope
like
John Paul the First.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
He, for like
Wait,
three.
He was the one from The Godfather. He's the one from The Godfather. Like, he was like, he was trying to take all these interests he tried to take on all these interests within the church, and he was murdered. I mean that's not officially known, but I mean it's known, right? Like, so it's like, so John Paul II is like, holy shit, like what do I do?
Because he's
like,
line that he died of pneumonia or something.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, but it's like, and I think the Da Vinci Code or one of those books is also like where the Pope is killed, angels and demons. I think they're also taking from that too, that like, in the 60s, this tumultuous time for like church history, like there's popes who like, they get the axe. Like, Kennedy's murdered, so why not, kill the Pope too? You can kill anybody. And so, so I think
the time you could do anything.
I know, right? Jeez, like, hello NSA, right? But anyway, so I think, I think that's probably one of the reasons why he didn't go after some of these pedophiles, because they had a lot of power. They had a ton of power in like their own circles, and because a lot of them were connected to bishops and money and even drug traffickers in Latin America too. And I think also just because it's power. I mean, like, he's got to leave certain people in place. Otherwise, what's going to happen? Who's going to take over? And yeah, Ratzinger, he's conservative. I mean, I remember him too being really conservative. And Francis is like, again, trying to go back to these, really, what's the word I want to use here? Kind of like going to the original sentiment of what this was supposed to be about, right? But, like, hey, like we should take an oath of poverty, whatever. But again, like it is the Vatican, it is the church. Like, how much can they really do that? Or are they going to do that? So, yeah, that's what I have to contribute at this point on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, and I'm not here to like specifically bash the Catholic Church, something I know almost nothing about. But since you did mention my line on celebrity and spectacle, this is the process by which a like reaction, and like specifically the kinds of politics or the system that like diffuses revolutionary consciousness and potential, like this is the process by which it happens. So the church then successfully like incorporated basically revolutionary challenges
Are you
to
doing
it.
a Gramscian analysis of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, basically. But I mean, I'm not here. I'm no expert. I'm just saying that's the dynamic as it appears.
I mean, it's like what you and I were talking about our episode on fascism, Rob, and populism. It's like the aesthetic, aspect of politics that like draws people, right? The aesthetic, and then they don't do real politics. They don't actually challenge like the structures that are there, right? So we talked about this too in some of our episodes on the podcast. So I agree.
So unless you have anything more to say about John Paul II, like just to, as our last segment, like what's the situation today? And specifically, like when we went through the outline, to me, it seems like it's coming full circle, because right now there's something, if John Paul is the Obama Pope who's like limiting, I don't know, kinds of different forms of politics or, challenges or revolution. It seems like now
The old Pope is literally writing like the Turner Diaries in his spare time. Okay, like
I'm just saying then the parallel today would be how, just to take the United States as an example, people are going outside the Democratic Party, or there's some kinds of new, like it cannot cohere this, the system anymore. Like it's not, there's challenges. And then at the same time, of course, there's new kinds of tradcaths and other kinds of like socialist Catholics. Maybe that's just all online, but there's definitely lots of different elements of this.
I think you're absolutely right about that. At least in the example of the United States, I don't know about Europe because I don't think I've ever met an actual practicing Catholic in Europe. So, but I do know for a fact that then, and you see this if you ever turn on Fox News to any of our listeners in the U.S., that there's a massive Catholic, like conservative reawakening that is very much against the current Pope, that they don't even view him as the Pope, actually. Like, they still view, maybe I don't know if they view, like, Benedict XVI as the Pope, but they like him more because he was more openly conservative, more open. I mean, now he's just openly Islamophobic. And there is all this stuff that they can also justify the Trump bullshit with much more.
Exactly.
The old version, like literally just with like the teachings of the last Pope than with the new one. I mean, Francis being, giving these just like weak ass like statements of just, but like got to do something about climate change, and then maybe sipping too much of that like Protestant work ethic bullshit that the United States, because I mean American Catholics want to pretend that they're Protestant so much without having to actually convert. So they have taken in all of like the idiosyncrasies of like capitalism and with the Protestant work ethic and whatnot, but they don't like Catholicism. I would honestly say, like at its core, which like we mentioned, Francis is kind of going back to this what Catholicism is, at least in my opinion, is oath of poverty, somewhat to a degree of anti-capitalism, or maybe not anti-capitalism, but anti
kind of anti-colonialism almost too, in some ways too.
Yeah. And it really is kind of the sense of that for American Protestants or Catholics who think that they're Protestant. This goes against everything that the United States is also for. So there is, I think that you're absolutely right in this, that there has to be then also, I think even like the head of the American Catholic Church currently right now is also very much against Francis. I know for a fact that there's plenty of bishops who don't like him in the United States. Churches have become much more, Catholic churches have become much more politicized, I would probably argue, since Roe v. Wade, but they've also then become encompassing, much more typical conservative issues as well. So things that I think Catholics would be better about, especially within like the Latino community, such as immigration is one. A lot of American Catholics have a very hard line approach to immigration for whatever fucking reason. Just it goes on and on and on, that they've just kind of become a wing of like like a conservative wing of, they're not a party, but they'll vote Republican typically and all this other stuff because the social issues point them to this direction. Maybe you can add to that, but that's at least what I see, just of like with people that I know who are Catholic or grew up with in the United States. They all have these psychotic, like right wing beliefs now, if they're still remotely Catholic.
No, I completely agree with you, Nick. I think that's spot on in many ways. Because, so just to back it up a little bit, there's a lot of people who don't like Pope Francis. I mean, I have a lot of relatives who don't like Pope Francis because they see him as being too progressive. Exactly that. Like they maybe they liked Ratzinger, maybe they didn't. They all love John Paul II, but it's like they're really Catholics have become really conservative in the last 20, 30 years. Increasingly so. I think kind of to bring this full circle. In the case of Mexico, a lot of religious conservatives, conservative Catholics are really fond of Donald Trump. They love Donald Trump because of the pro-life issue. In Latin America in the last 4 years, actually, ironically enough, around the same time of the Trump election, there's been a feminist reawakening all over. I mean, I think it started in Argentina and Chile and the Southern Cone, but now it's all over Latin America. And it's millennial, multiracial feminist coalitions that are really getting at issues of gender violence and reproductive rights. Because there's just so much in Mexico specifically, femicide is such a huge issue. Women are murdered like brutally and horribly, and it just happens, more often than it should ever happen, obviously. But it's just like there's very much a gendered dynamic to the violent crime that's really taken off. And so what happens is that Catholics are looking at these feminist movements who are calling for not just an end to gender violence and patriarchy and law, but just also calling for the legalization of abortion, because in a lot of Latin American countries, abortion is still illegal. It's still criminalized. And in Mexico, it's locally. You have to locally figure out, which state does what, and some are, early and some are late term or whatever. And it's really crazy. So what Catholics are doing in these countries is that they're looking at someone like Trump and they're like, hey, he's our guy because he's staunchly pro-life, right? Even though he aborted, I don't know how many kids that he had with porn stars or whatever the fuck, right? He's on his third marriage.
You mad at the president of the United States because he fucks. Wow, that's a real podcaster point.
There's a meme that just came out yesterday or recently with Melania Trump saying Donald Trump will never leave you, and then at the bottom it's they put coming from his third wife, right? It's really crazy because they're really taking to Donald Trump on the pro-life issue, but I think the pro-life issue is really just a way to try to oppress these feminist movements, and I think racism is a huge part of this because these elite Catholic conservatives are white, they're in the elites of society, they're predominantly white or European descendants, and then the feminists are mixed race, indigenous, black, and so there's a lot of racism imbued into this, and it's gotten to a point it's disgusting really, where this year alone, I think I've talked to Rob about this, and some of our friends from school, but even some of my own relatives will post stuff on Facebook that's just oh my god, memes and images of Trump whisking babies away from the jaws of death, and you look at they put Hillary Clinton's face on the devil, and it's just this horrible, horrible, really right-wing shit that's it gets really spread into these, social media circles. And so, I think there's kind of a couple of things happening here. I think the current Pope is not popular with conservative Latin American Catholics. I think the rise of the left in Latin America is drawing people to conservatism. And I think Trumpism is part of this too, because Trumpism taps into that religious conservatism, adds those dimensions of racism to it, and it makes it okay, and it makes it totally okay. So I think that's where it is now. I do think I agree with Nick that churches are really politicized now and really divided. Not all Catholics vote Republican, but a lot of them do. I would say definitely in the last election, the majority of them voted for Trump. I'd be interesting to see how that pans down this year with Biden. I still think probably a lot of them will vote for Trump, but Biden being a Catholic,
Biden's not a real Catholic.
We
that's
are
true.
attempting to promote pan-Catholicism with this podcast, a little Italian and Mexican Catholicism, and Joe Biden is here to lead the Catholic coalition of the future.
No, who's gonna, who I love though? Andrew Cuomo. Man, I'm name dropping that right now. He got up. Nobody was doing.
Your governor.
Yeah, man. Nobody was doing shit. Nobody was doing shit when the kids were getting separated at the border. And Andrew Cuomo stands in this podium on a Catholic church, right? And he says, start with me, right? I'm the son of an immigrant, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, he's just, maybe he's grandstanding or whatever, but...
He's got the John Paul II swag.
Well, the thing is, it's a lot of these Democrat Catholics are, they're kind of weak sauce. I mean, Democrats are just weak sauce all around, but they're not really doing anything. And that's why I think the Republicans have really... claimed the religious mantle. And I think to Nick's point, I think that's why a lot of Catholics today, like they behave and they vote like they're these evangelical Protestants, but they're not, right? I mean, and so
Yeah, you're not. You'll never be a part
Yeah.
of the crew. Like you just won't. They still hate Catholics.
they're
which is
still
the-
gonna
like,
see
the funniest
right
shit to me.
exactly, and they're getting up and they're defending Amy Coney Barrett, and they're like, oh, all this anti-Catholic vitriol, you know, I haven't seen this since John Kennedy. I'm like, you fucking hate John Kennedy. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you fucking hate John Kennedy. Like, don't come up here and tell us that you love Jack Kennedy and that Amy Coney Barrett is fucking Jack Kennedy. Like, you hated the Kennedys, right? So I don't know. I
Well,
think
you
it's
just mentioned her. I just want to put the
Yeah.
context. We're recording this on a Wednesday, a little early for us this
Isn't she
week.
Oh,
supposed
Jesus,
to
yeah.
be tomorrow or Friday?
tomorrow. They're voting on her tomorrow, and she'll probably
Yeah,
get
so
confirmed. Yeah.
by the time you listen to this, she might be already on
First
the court.
Catholic Supreme Court Justice.
No, they're all Catholic.
No, okay, there are a bunch of Catholics.
No, yeah, no. Alito is too as well.
They're all. I mean, all the
Sotomayor is
conservative.
also Catholic.
all of the
Sotomayor.
conservatives are
Yeah.
Catholic.
yeah.
Even
is
Sotomayor
funny.
is
Thomas
Catholic.
isn't Catholic. Isn't
Yeah, he is.
Catholic. Wait, he's Catholic?
Yeah, they're all Catholic.
What?
Which is funny because the right wing
That's
in the
what you
U.S.
do. That's
is
what you do.
Protestants,
Oh, no,
but
here it is, here
they've
it is.
never read a book.
All right,
so they're
no.
like,
I figured it out.
We got to find 6 Catholic
Yeah, I got it.
conservatives to lead us.
I figured it out. You got it. Yeah,
That's the Pope, American popes.
exactly.
Yeah.
You gotta. You know, the Supreme Court is just like the sandbox where the Catholics are allowed to play. But if they fucking think about ending up in the executive branch of government,
Yeah,
that's fucking
in
it.
the
We're gonna kill
presidency.
them.
Yeah,
That's why
exactly.
John Roberts, he's like, do you know what would happen? We have to keep it under control.
Yeah, we gotta keep
I
them
just-
over there in the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Yeah, all I have to say is that then, I am forming then the first and maybe the best American Catholic Communist Party. You can join me. where,
Dude, that'd
we
be
will,
awesome.
I mean, it is the only logical way to
Well,
be like...
you brought it up. I mean, like I said, it's maybe just an internet thing, but on my Twitter, there are people who, like, I would say usually, like, just people raised Catholic who are like, are socialist and try and claim a kind of social Catholicism.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, there are people who usually didn't grow up Catholic who see in the Catholic Church and the iconography some kind of like I'm talking about like alt-right,
Yeah.
like Pepe kids who are like just become Catholic because they're like
Yeah.
they love
yeah,
the
yeah.
tradition.
They love the
and
trad shit.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah,
exactly.
being
I think,
trad.
if you grew up with Catholicism, it's not, I mean, there are way worse things to grow up as. Is the Catholic
Exactly.
Church a weird fucking institution? Absolutely. Are the teachings, are the overall overwhelming majority of the things that the Catholic Church teaches you good things that then are, will lead to, that fall into some version of a social liberation theory? Yeah, they like absolutely. And if you
Yeah,
don't
for
take
sure.
that, like, if you don't take that out of it, like, I don't like just the thing with like immigration and whatnot to me as being like from like how they're so conservative and they just kind of like they don't even like question it. It's so weird to me because even like I remember like 10 years ago or so going to church that then like the church I went to had a very open stance about immigration. That
Oh,
then
God.
it was like, hey,
Wait, what was this, Nick? What city was this?
This is in Phoenix.
Oh,
So-
God. Yeah, Jesus.
So you have then the sense of that the Catholic Church was actually going against then what a lot of its own people in the like the parish that then I was a part of was going against then what a lot of then the churchgoers thought because they were saying that then like
Yeah.
okay like this, like the border detention things are against what we believe, deportations are against what we believe, this and that and I would be very curious now about what they're saying because it has like all these issues have kind of just been like kind of packed into this like very pro-Trump sort of thing that they like I don't know it weirds like just from my own personal perspective it really weirds me out that my mom who is very 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 devout she's a very devout Catholic is like has these insane positions when it comes to like border treatment and stuff like that and I think a majority of Americans is probably this similar thing as
But that's the thing. It's like that's what I was saying. It's like Trump and especially the pro-life issue because that's when you ask them why are you voting for Trump, they're like, oh, because he's pro-life. Like that's what a lot of Catholics say. Like even my sister who is Catholic and she has such a hard time with her friends because she's voting for Biden and she votes for Democrats, but all her friends are like just these really nasty Republicans, and it's like why? And it's like, oh, because it's pro-life and this and that, and they keep coming back to the pro-life issue, but really like Trump, what he's doing, I mean, it's not even about abortion. Like he gives people permission, and this is Catholics or anybody. He gives people permission to like voice like their deepest, most visceral, most awful like hatred and racism. And so I mean, no offense to your mom or anybody, but just I feel like what happens with a
that's
lot of what happens with a lot of like.
I wouldn't have brought my mom up in this if it wasn't fair game. So.
I hope she's not listening to this podcast, but
Absolutely not. I've never told my mom the name of my show. So yeah.
all I'm
No offense
saying
to your
is
mom, Nick.
what Trump is
general
doing is that he allows for people to like all that stuff that they would never say in public and that they would never express to even like their kids or their relatives. He gives them a vehicle where like it makes it okay. And so part of it, I'm sure, I mean, the topic of immigration, a lot of it is just racism. It's like, oh, these immigrants, even if you're Italian, even if you're this, it's like, well, you know, they're dirty and they're this and that. And so it's
Italians who aren't racist? What?
yeah, exactly. And it's just like, I don't know. I feel like, yeah, I think that's what the Trump phenomenon is about. It's really just like giving people permission to like just tap into that. One of my professors in grad school, she did a lecture on this when he was first elected, and she works on religious studies, actually, of all things. And her name is Katie Lofton. She's great. She wrote a really good book about Oprah as like a religious figure in American culture and like American consumerism as religion. And she was comparing Trump to a video game character and saying how like Trump is an avatar that like makes it okay for you to like hit your wife or punch your boss or curse out people on the street, you know? And it's just like, it's true. I mean, I think that's what it's getting into. And unfortunately, I think Catholicism has a lot of really, you know, these very impulses that we're talking about. I mean, we mentioned them when we talked about fascism. There's a lot of these impulses in Catholicism. And Trump is just like allowing them. Because you're right. I mean, if you listen to what's actually being said, and if you really take the messages, like this should be like, I mean, Jesus was a socialist Jew, right? Like he was an immigrant. He was a fucking immigrant, right? But people don't listen to it and they just get really wrapped up into like all this other bullshit.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'll say let's do one last round. If anyone has any final thoughts or comments, because I have
I'm good. I just join my Catholic Communist Party. That's all I asked for.
I'm down.
Because I tried to articulate this on our episode, Ricky, and it's just there's some connection here between you mentioned the like anti-abortion movement has been so key in kind of this right-wing organization. At the same time, there's this feeling now of kind of what you described with the millenarianism of the 1920s and 1930s, that it's the end of the world. I mean, literally, if you take the science of climate change seriously, it seems like the fucking end of the world. And you have people, and at the same time, you have a social structure. We talk about the end of history a lot. You have a social structure which gives people no tools to think through the world changing, you know?
Right.
And I don't think that, and I think what's useful about religion, and I say this as someone who grew up non-religious, like as like the peak American Protestantism, where you just don't have anything. You're like trapped completely. you're trapped into like thinking an ideology, but like it's like you don't even know it's the ideology. Like at least you're not even given any rituals or shit to like contextualize it. You're just like that's the world. But I mean that captures the end of history feeling, right? Because it's like all of these systems of of capitalism or how the world works today is just baked in and naturalized. It's not historicized or contextualized. And I think that what I see in religion, when in organized religion as an outsider, is at least the ability to think through questions of like fucking existence, right? Which is what a lot of political movements and nascent socialist movements in the U.S. or wherever are trying to do. Right. They're trying to think like it sounds so cringe sometimes when people are like, "Oh, we're gonna build fully automated luxury space communism." The reason it sounds
you need Catholicism in order to get the
reason
idea.
It sounds cringe is because how the fuck do you think about the future as as human beings? It's a hard question, and it seems to me that like this is why like anti-abortion, like the pro-life thing in particular, is a core thing because it's like okay, but we have to hold onto life somehow. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like I just think for any political movement, and this, going back to what Mark said, and not even in the sense that it must be immediately abolished, but the language of religion must be thought through in any kind of political movement because it represents what is the fucking, what are we all doing? Like, why even have a better political system and stuff like that? So I don't even know what I think about that, but you guys just reminded me of my thoughts on this.
I think just to I mean, we mentioned this much earlier in the show. I think that's the perfect example to how Catholicism was just used then as this vehicle for a lot of movements. I mean, Latin America was very much as Ricky mentioned, there wasn't like one cohesive conservative line. There were a lot of priests who did become, socialist or communist. It's actually weirdly illustrated really well in the first season of Narcos.
Oh yeah,
if you've seen,
yeah, for sure.
like
Yeah,
the first 3 or 4 episodes, there's like all these communist nuns who were helping against the CIA and whatnot. So this is, I mean, like one of the most famous figures, although he wasn't explicitly communist, was still at least like socialist, like in terms of his view of the world. It was like Oscar Romero, who was murdered by a CIA death squad. So there was, regardless of if they knew it as communism or not, or whatever it was, like there was a factor that then did allow this to become, I would say, not maybe cohesive, but a liberation theory that then, and I think that the example of luxury space communism is the best because it's so out there and ridiculous, but being a good person and building for your community is something that you can actualize in that moment. And Catholicism allowed this for a lot of people. And I think that then, although, yes, the European version of it and the thing, like the trad reaction is right wing, there is something that then I would say is like inherently in the moment immaterial about this as well, that we also have like we can't just, put it in one basket and say that then it's all reactionary and fascist, because that's just historically inaccurate. So I think that's a perfect point to make, Rob.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think just to close it out, I think one thought that I'll pose is that if you break down religion to like its barest bones, which is basically a set of ideologies and a set of rituals, political movements, even secular political movements, are religious in some ways. There's a set of ideologies that you ascribe to, right? There's
literally have a painting of Lenin in my room. Like, and it's not ironic.
There's, a set of ideologies that you ascribe to. There's a set of rituals that you perform, whether that's voting, whether that's marching, whether that is, we talked about fascism. There's a lot of rituals in fascism. And there's a cult of personality. There's people who get deified in the political canon, right? I mean, we talked about Kennedy. We talked about, right? There's people who are the saints of, nation states. So I think religion is permeating everything. Even secular politics is religious. I mean, it comes from a Protestant religious tradition. So I think religion and politics, I think it's natural for them to communicate in the ways that we're seeing. However, I think what we're seeing with Catholicism is not necessarily religious, but I would call it more like fundamentalist. Like that's what it really feels like to me. It feels
White
like
Sharia, if you will.
Yeah, like it just feels like it's very. It's a very narrow view of what religion actually is, not just ideologically speaking, but what it can actually do for people. And so it's like it gets pigeonholed into like religion is what tells us how to think of these social issues, whether it's abortion or whatever. I mean, that's what the ideologies tell you, but religion is also about a bigger, if you think about religion globally, not just Christianity, but it's about what we were saying, right? Rob and I were saying, and you were saying like at the beginning, it's like, how to deal with the end of the world, how to deal with existential questions, how to deal with your role as an individual in the universe and the world and society. So I think what we're seeing is the co-option of religion for these very narrow fundamentalist aims. And so I think that's what's happening in the US. I think it's happening in other parts of the world. And it's not even Catholics. I mean, this started with Reagan, in the 80s. It started in the, evangelical movement. It started before that. So I think moving forward, I think there needs to be a reclaiming of religion for what it actually is supposed to do and what it actually is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be this conservative, method of surveillance. It's supposed to be some tool of empowerment. I mean, that's ideally what it was supposed to be about, right? Think about Jesus. It was about empowering people. It was about, some religions talk about mobilizing people. All of them talk about, the poor. And, nobody here is like, hey, like, be like this rich guy, who is like, on his third marriage and whatever. Like, and so that's the thing. I feel like it's just,
they definitely
capitalism is the religion that is about that, right? And so, and so that's the thing. I think when we move forward, I'd be interested in seeing if these questions are reformulated in some way, or as Rob and I discussed in our episode on fascism, if this is just a death drive that's taking us into a downward spiral, and there's just not going to be anything but these superficial attacks on other people, and really no sort of thorough engagement in politics or religion for that matter. So we'll see what happens, but I don't know.
On that point, Ricky and I plan to be live for one potential downward death spiral in the coming weeks. I'm speaking specifically of, it's November 3rd, election night in the U.S.
Yeah, that's the 3rd.
The moment we've all been waiting for. Honestly, who fucking knows what'll happen. Ricky and I will be live on the, it's going to be, I don't know, a Corner Späti, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised collab. I don't know.
Up.
We might have
Sounds good.
We might have some signs in the background or something. I will be, if everything goes smoothly, I will be in Ricky's living room where I see him sitting right now.
That'd be cool. Yeah. Yeah, we're here.
And we will be streaming, just live reaction. We'll be watching CNN or something.
Jeff Toobin.
Who knows? We're gonna try to avoid a Toobin.
Jeff Toobin's gonna live stream from his basement, and we're gonna watch
it. So that's going to be, I don't know when we're going to start. More information to come. 6 p.m., 7 p.m. I don't know. Whenever we're going to be when we're watching TV. So
start coming in around.
I guess whenever returns
8 Eastern.
Start.
We can start around that time.
And we'll go until whenever we. I don't know.
Well,
we can't take it.
Rob has a lot of more nocturnal energy than I do, so Rob can go until like 7 in the morning. I'm probably going to go until like 1 a.m. because I'm just like so tired. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, we're so the lineup isn't finalized. We're gonna take call-ins. I think Nick might call in. Anyone else? Any of our friends listening, let us know if you want to call in. That is going to be again on twitch.tv/cornerspäti, November 3rd, starting around 7 or 8 Eastern time. That's 1 or 2 a.m. here in Berlin. But I know some of you stay up late. And I don't know. Anything else you want to say about that? I hope you tune in. If you like this analysis, there'll be much more of that. If you ask questions in chat about Catholicism, we will answer them.
What's your favorite prayer? Who's your favorite saint?
The Nicene Creed, right? No. So I just want to say thank you to both of you guys for hosting me here. It was really fun.
Anything else you want to plug, by the way? Stuff you're working on?
Well, I'm working on an article right now on which hopefully will be published by the end of the year. It's on white supremacy in Mexico, whiteness, and how it intersects with religious conservatism and pro-Americanism and anti-indigenous violence. So, and I do talk about Trump, and I do talk about this pro-life stuff that we mentioned in the conversation. So, I can definitely, once it's out, hopefully, I can plug it in the description for our podcast or anywhere. Get people to read about it. I think it'd be really interesting. And I just want to thank you both for hosting me. I thought that was really fun. I've never laughed so much talking about Catholicism. It was really a fun time. And apologies to Nick's mother if I offended you. I didn't mean to. And also just looking forward to getting as many viewers or listeners into our live stream, and to encourage everybody to keep listening to this podcast and our podcast, because I think it'd be great to just simultaneously plug both of our podcasts.
For sure.
Yeah. I'm not going to plug anything. So on that note, we will see you all the next week. Thank you once again, Ricky, for being on. I had a wonderful time.
It was fun.
I learned a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. It was great. Thank you both.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
All right.